Today's episode was produced by Eric Krupke, Olivia Natt, and Stella Tan. It was edited by Brendan Klinkenberg with help from Michael Benoit. Fact-checked by Susan Lee. Contains original music by Marian Lozano, Dan Powell, Rowan Misto, Diana Wong, and Sophia Matthews, and was engineered by Alyssa Moxley with help from Chris Wood. Our theme music is by Jim Runberg and Ben Landsberg of Wonderly. That's it for the Daily. I'm Sabrina Tavernise. See you tomorrow.
TurboTax makes all your moves count, and roughly 37% of taxpayers qualify to file 100% free, the TurboTax Free Edition. Form 1040 and limited credits only. File 100% free, max refund guarantee. See if you qualify to file for free at TurboTax.com. See max refund guarantee details at TurboTax.com/guarantees.
We got another day of NBA action. And with FanDuel, every night is a watch party. So it's time for your FanDuel crew to make their bets. So, what's the move tonight, gang? You know the new customers who bet $5 get $150 back in bonus bets? Woohoo! We're heating up, fam! Bet all the stars with all your friends and make every moment more only on FanDuel. New customers bet $5 get $150 back in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.
It goes down in the field, it goes down in the field.
21 plus the president in Ohio. First online real money wager only. $10 first deposit required. Bonus issue is non-withdrawable bonus license expires 7 days after receipt. See full terms at FanDuel.com/sportsbook. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
Hey!
Ooh, it's the competition.
The competition is on for only a couple more weeks, ladies and gentlemen. You got to go to badfriendsmerch.com. We're competing to see who can sell more shirts, and the losers
Accused Jennifer Crumbley and her husband of ignoring signs her son was troubled and instead buying him the gun he used to kill 4 classmates at Oxford High in November 2021. In court, computer crimes expert Edward Rodrowski testified the son texted a friend he was seeing things, but claimed his parents refused to take him to a doctor.
Yeah, the hallucinations, that could have been warnings for seeing demons.
Defense attorneys counter that Crumbley allegedly never saw the messages and had no idea her son was spiraling downward. Crumbley herself is expected to take the stand in the days ahead. For NPR News, I'm Quinn Kleinfelter in Detroit.
This is NPR News from Washington.
Good morning. It's 8:32, 33 degrees in Cincinnati. This is 91.7 WVXU. I'm Marianne Selesnik. The Brent Spence Bridge Corridor revamp is taking another step forward. Ohio and Kentucky transportation officials say the federal government's approved environmental assessments for the $3.6 billion project. Now it's your turn to weigh in. ODOT and KYTC will hold public hearings in Covington February 20th and in Cincinnati February 21st. A virtual option will also be available February 22nd. You can find out more at WVXU.org. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear says a bill that would prohibit diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives would have negative ramifications on Kentucky colleges and universities if it becomes law. House Bill 9, sponsored by Republican Representative Jennifer Decker, would eliminate departments and staff positions related to DEI in public universities or colleges. Governor Beshear, speaking during a recent visit to Bowling Green, pointed out the measure coincides with the upcoming presidential election.
At the end of the day, I think we've got to push aside these attempts to rile people up for the next election, which is what this is about, and say that we are our brother and sister's keeper.
The bill would require higher education institutions to complete a report of the name, job, title, and compensation of every individual they've employed since 2019 who worked in a DEI position. A growing number of small cities across Ohio are developing rental registry programs. These programs collect landlord contact information, and sometimes mandate property inspections. Lima City Councilwoman Carla Thompson says the city passed an ordinance this month to create more accountability for property owners. She says many in her ward struggle with unresponsive, out-of-state landlords.
It's not that everybody deserves a chandelier in the kitchen, but everybody deserves to feel like they can walk through their living room without falling through the floor. Like, everybody deserves safe housing.
Lima's program will ensure landlords from outside Ohio designate a local property manager to assist with emergencies. Corporate landlords are a concern across the state. Investors bought up around 33,000 single-family homes in Ohio in 2021. In college basketball, the Xavier men lost to Hartford 99-56. The NKU men lost to Youngstown 82-52. In hockey, the Cyclones dropped to the Walleye 9-1. 33 degrees now in Cincinnati.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Easy Cater, committed to helping companies from nonprofits to the Fortune 500 find food for meetings and company events with online ordering and 24/7 live support. Learn more at easycater.com. From Indeed, designed to be an end-to-end hiring solution for businesses of all sizes to attract, interview, and hire candidates, all from a single platform. Learn more at Indeed.com/NPR. And from the Doris Duke Foundation.
It's Morning Edition from NPR News. I'm Martinez in Los Angeles, California.
And I'm Steve Inskeep in Washington, D.C. Here's what the United States does and does not want to do after an attack in the Middle East.
The U.S. does want to respond to a drone attack that killed 3 U.S. soldiers. It does not want flare-ups in the Middle East to grow into a low-level regional war. The U.S. blames a group backed by Iran. Iran, in turn, has been supporting Hamas in its war against Israel.
Pretty complicated, but NPR's Jane Araf has been following it all from Jordan, which is the country where this attack took place, we are told. Hey there, Jane.
Hi, Steve.
Well, what exactly happened?
Well, according to the Pentagon, an explosive drone struck a support base on the Jordanian side of its border with Syria, killing 3 service people and wounding at least 34 others. 8 of them were wounded seriously enough to be medevac for treatment, and Steve, many of those injured sustained traumatic brain injuries, so the number of wounded might rise as personnel are evaluated. Iran, by the way, denies being involved in attacks on U.S. forces, saying that was between what it calls resistance groups, militias that have escalated attacks on the U.S. military since the war in Gaza began.
And there certainly have been attacks in multiple countries in recent months by groups that the U.S. says are supported by Iran. But let me ask about this specific attack and the background. What are U.S. forces doing in Jordan?
Well, the Pentagon said the base that was hit was a logistics support base. It's known as Tower 22 of the Jordanian Support Network. It said there were about 350 U.S. Army and Air Force personnel there. A Defense Department statement said they're supporting anti-ISIS operations. But that support base is just across from Al-Tenf, a U.S. base in Syria, which also monitors activity by Iran-backed groups. So U.S. forces here, including Special Forces operators, maintain low-profile bases in Jordan and across the border in Syria, where they're partnering with local security forces in fighting ISIS. But here's an interesting wrinkle. Since the rise of ISIS in 2014, Kataib Hezbollah, the Iran-backed militia, has also operated in that border area.
So we've got ISIS to look at, we've got Iran to look at, in this area that I think Americans don't think about very much, and if it's low-profile bases, we're kind of encouraged not to think about very much, but U.S. troops are there on both sides of that border. So how might the U.S. respond now that they've been attacked in this effective way?
Well, President Biden has made clear that he blames Iran-backed groups, despite that denial, and he says the U.S. will retaliate. But that's the dilemma. Since the Gaza war started in October, there have been fears that this could flare into a wider regional war if Iran is brought into it, and that's potentially what we're looking at. Military analysts are expecting the U.S. to retaliate directly against Iranian forces in the region now. So far, Iran has not directly confronted the U.S. And Steve, we have to keep in mind that the U.S. already faces threats on several fronts sparked by the war in Gaza. There are attacks by Yemen's Houthis, attacks by Iran-backed militias. And this week, the U.S. began talks with Iraq on withdrawing all of their troops, and that too has an Iran link. Pressure from Iran-backed militias that are a key part of Iraqi security and politics.
Jane, thanks for the insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
This is NPR's Jane Raff in Amman.
There's a growing rift between President Biden and many black clergy members over the war in Gaza. Hundreds of black faith leaders representing many thousands of congregants are calling for a ceasefire, and they want the Biden administration to do the same. Reverend Leah Daughtry joins me now. She's the national presiding prelate of the House of the Lord Churches, a network of churches throughout the U.S. She was also CEO of the 2008 and 16 Democratic National Convention committees. Good morning, Reverend. The death toll in Gaza, now more than 26,000. That's according to the health ministry there. As a person of faith, how do you view this war?
Well, good morning, and you're right, the death toll is really heartbreaking. And from the beginning, immediately after October 7th, I joined with colleagues to call for the return of the hostages, the ceasefire, bilateral ceasefire, humanitarian aid to flow freely to those who need it, and for an intensified peace process in the region to address what we view as an escalating war, an escalating conflict among the countries there. So what we see now is, of course, there was the horrific attack on October 7th. Families are still separated because the hostages are being held. But you have this growing death toll, people who are being killed by the IDF, but also people who are being killed through starvation because they don't have food and water. We as faith leaders have to be concerned about the moral toll of this war and what our authority is and what our responsibility is in ensuring that all people are safe, are able to live their lives in freedom and security, and that all children are able to grow and to live a thriving life.
Reverend, I grew up in the Pentecostal church. I've always known that there is a spiritual kinship between some Christians and Israel. At the same time, many black Americans see themselves in Palestinians. Why do you think that is?
Well, you know, we do have a kinship with the land of Israel because it is the land of the book. It's the land of our text. I just came from Israel in the spring, taking a delegation of people to view the sites that connect with our faith. But the land that is written about in the Old Testament is very different from the government of Benjamin Netanyahu. And so we observe that difference. And we believe that we have to be on the side of the oppressed as God is. And when you see the disparate living circumstances and how they are being disproportionately impacted by this, 26,000, mostly women and children, we believe that our responsibility is to speak for them and to identify with them in the circumstances that they find themselves in at this moment. We believe that's where God would be.
Is it difficult, though, sometimes, as you said, that's the land of the book, right? So is there a conflict within Christians, you think, of trying to understand how to support people who are suffering and then also support what they really are, the people of the book, Israel?
Well, you know, I think what we're trying to do, of course, first of all, Christianity is not monolith, so you want to find diversities of opinion. However, even in the Holy Text, God takes a stand.
The anchor, Hadar Marks, says Chaim Perry is 79 years old. He and more than 200 Israelis were taken hostage on October 7th during Hamas's deadly ambush, the largest number of civilians taken captive in Israeli history. The anchor addresses this hostage and says, "We will meet, and things will be good." She says, "I hope you can hear this," and plays a song by one of his favorite singers. This is not just wishful thinking. About half of the hostages were released a couple months ago in an exchange for hundreds of Palestinian detainees, and some of them said their guards had let them listen to Israeli radio while they were held in Gaza. The distances here are short. Radio frequencies reach across borders. Here's an example.
היי, קוראים לי גיל דיקמן מתל אביב. שבוע נפרדנו מכנרת גת, בת 68 מקיבוץ בארי. כנרת נרצחה בידי מחבלי החמאס שחדרו לבית שלה וחטפו גם את הבת שלה, כרמל גת, ואת כלתה, ירדן רומן גת, שנעדרות עכשיו. כנרת הייתה אישה ומחנכת נפלאה ואהבה יותר מהכל לשיר ולטייל.
Gil Dickman recorded this message, which aired on Israeli public radio. He spoke about his aunt who was killed on October 7th and his two cousins who were taken hostage. He told us that when one of his cousins was released, she told the family she'd heard that broadcast in captivity. That's how she learned what had happened to her other relatives, and how she knew her family understood she was being held in Gaza.
People tell you, if she listens to you right now, what would you say? What would you want her to hear? And I always feel like, okay, no way she can hear me. But it turns out that thanks to the fact that radio is such an analog platform, it was possible.
It's the only Israeli channel of communication reaching some of the hostages.
She said that that was one of the most important things for her while she was in captivity, keeping her strong, knowing that her husband and child are still alive, and that we fight for her.
Some of the released hostages say they didn't have any access to a radio or TV in captivity, but the fact that some did has changed how Israeli radio is broadcasting now. Galei Tzahal, Israeli Army radio, is the country's most listened to broadcaster. Every day it airs messages from Israelis to their relatives captive in Gaza. Turn the dial to Palestinian radio, and you'll hear something similar. Radio Ajial is based in the West Bank city of Ramallah. Every week, it broadcasts voice messages from Palestinians to their family members in Israeli jails. Here's a short voice message the radio station played. It's from 18-year-old Dima Ali. Her father, Ala-ad-Din Ali, was taken away by Israeli soldiers 5 days into the war. She addresses her dad and says, "Everything at home is fine, university's good, don't worry about us." She has no idea if he's heard it.
We have no connection to reach to him or to speak with him. Where's the human rights? Where's the prisoner rights? Even the lawyer can't reach to him.
In the past, Israel accused him of having ties to Hamas, which the family denies. During this war, Israel has detained thousands of Palestinians. More than 8,000 are jailed now.
It's horrible after October 7th inside the Israeli prison.
Radio Ajial's editor-in-chief Walid Nassar says the station has been flooded with short voice messages since the start of the war, because Israel has cut off the connection prisoners had to outside the prison walls. Palestinian prisoners are no longer allowed family visits. The Red Cross no longer gets access to deliver letters between families and prisoners. Lawyers are given minimal access to meet prisoners. Israel says the measures are to prevent prisoners from coordinating attacks from inside jail. Palestinian prisoner advocates call it a policy of revenge.
So these messages are very crucial for the prisoners inside the prisons when they can't reach the outside communication.
For Palestinian and Israeli families, the concern is not knowing about their loved ones in extreme and difficult conditions. Some Israeli hostages and Palestinian detainees have died while being held. There are growing allegations of physical abuse against Palestinians in Israeli jails, and even sexual abuse against Israelis in Hamas captivity. The head of Israeli Army Radio, Dani Zakin.
I can't do any comparison between these two populations, these two groups, hostages and prisoner terrorists. It's totally different. Here it's civilians mostly, hostages, and the Palestinian prisoners, most of them are terrorists.
Israel says it's arrested Hamas activists since the war began. Many detainees are held without charge, a tactic criticized by human rights groups. Israel says it's needed to prevent future attacks.
And in war against terror, you have to do some measures. Among them is lots of arrests. That's part of the war. After saying that, I can say that, of course, as every family that have her, the one that she loves, in jail, and I can understand what they're doing.
Since the war began, Israeli prison authorities say they've been confiscating radios from Palestinian prisoners. So who knows how many radios are left today for Palestinian detainees in Israel, or for Israeli hostages in Gaza. But Israeli and Palestinian radio stations are still broadcasting these messages. If anything, to give the families a platform to speak, and because you never know who's listening. Daniel Estrin, NPR News, from Ramallah and Tel Aviv.
Venezuela's leading opposition candidate says she's staying in this year's presidential race despite a ruling by the country's high court upholding a ban on her candidacy. Some people seeking fair and free elections in Venezuela want the U.S. to reinstate sanctions that the Biden administration lifted. NPR's Carrie Kahn reports.
Speaking to supporters in Caracas today, Maria Corina Machado defiantly rejected the ruling by Venezuela's Supreme Tribunal of Justice last week. It's not a sentence nor an arbitrary ruling, she says.
Esto se llama delincuencia judicial.
It is called judicial criminality, she says, and she has no plans to abandon her run for president against current leader Nicolás Maduro. She didn't specify her next steps. Machado won a presidential primary organized by opponents following a deal signed by Maduro officials promising to hold free and fair elections this year. The U.S. eased some sanctions on Venezuela. Today, U.S. National Security Council spokesman John Kirby says Venezuela must comply.
They need to make the right decisions here and allow opposition members to run for office and release the political prisoners.
He says Maduro has until April, according to the deal. He declined to preview options the U.S. is considering. Carrie Kahn, NPR News.
You're listening to All Things Considered from NPR News.
This is 91.7 WVXU. I'm Bill Reinhardt. Cincinnati officials just announced a long-awaited plan to reform the city's restrictive zoning code. WVXU's local government reporter Becca Costello started reporting on this nearly 2 years ago and joins us about the Connected Communities proposal.
Hello, Bill. Thanks for having me.
First, remind us what zoning is and why does it matter?
Zoning is the really detailed rules that dictate what you can build and where in the city. So a really obvious example would be you're not going to let a high polluting factory right next to a residential neighborhood for very obvious reasons. But a lot of the history of zoning, not just in Cincinnati, but across the country, it's really rooted in intentional segregation. So these were ways to keep neighborhoods from being mixed race. And those effects are still true today. And many other cities are looking at major changes, and Cincinnati really is just the latest.
Now, where is the mayor and other city officials who are on board with this? Where are they proposing to make changes in the city?
So it is a big plan. It's a little bit hard to summarize, but the very basics are they're focused on these major corridors. So this is where the Metro bus system has bus rapid transit, or will eventually have bus rapid transit on Hamilton Avenue and Reading Road, plus a half-mile buffer on either side of those. That's about a 10-minute walk. Also looking at other major corridors like Glenway, Harrison, Madison Road. That's where Metro currently has 24/7 service, and there's no buffer in those areas. It's just on the street itself. And then lastly, these neighborhood business districts, plus a quarter-mile buffer on either side, and that's about a 5-minute walk. So in all of those areas I just mentioned, you'd be able to build housing with up to 4 units, and that's even if the current zoning is for single family only, which is pretty significant. There are also rules about how many units you can put on a single lot, so this would be like for a multifamily apartment building, and this plan would eliminate those rules in most of the areas we talked about. One big thing, though, that is important to mention, so buildings along those major corridors I talked about, they can get a 1-story height bonus that's above the current limits. It's the only change to height restrictions in this plan, but that 1-story height bonus would not include single-family zones, even if they're within one of the areas we mentioned.
So under these changes, developers could add more housing in specific areas. What about parking? Are there parking requirements?
There are currently parking requirements, and some of those would go away in the plan that has been proposed. And these are some pretty significant changes too. So the current rules require quite a bit of parking for whether it's a residential building or a commercial building or mixed use. So the Connected Communities Plan says that citywide, there's no parking minimum if you're just renovating an existing building. That's important because a lot of buildings that were built before there were parking minimums in place obviously don't have parking, and in order to meet current requirements, they might have to demolish a building next door in order to do that. So in this case, if you're renovating an existing building, no parking minimums. Another citywide change is that if it's a residential building that's new, you need at least one parking space per unit. That's less than the current requirements, which are between 1 and 2 units depending on some factors. And then going back to those targeted areas, the neighborhood business districts and the major corridors. In those areas, there would be no parking minimums on the major corridors plus the half-mile buffer. That's for the Reading Road and Hamilton Avenue. In the neighborhood business districts, there'd be some reduced parking minimums. This gets very complicated depending on the use of the lot and the building, so it's a lot easier to understand if you just go online and read about it.
Our council members have fought over zoning changes before. They haven't been able to agree on some other big changes that were proposed a couple of years ago. What is different this time around?
Officials say a lot is different. For one thing, they're saying this is a lot more comprehensive. The ordinance that you mentioned 2 years ago was really just looking at zoning and only in certain areas that are zoned for multifamily, but this is looking at parking, density, setback, height, all kinds of things, not just density. They're also saying it's more specifically targeted to where people can easily access public transportation and in the city's most walkable neighborhoods, those business districts. So they've also said this has gone through a lot of community engagement already, and they've got some more community engagement planned, so that's another big difference, they say.
So what happens next?
There are a couple of engagement meetings scheduled for February, and then a much more in-depth kind of day-long meeting on March 23rd. The plans for an actual ordinance should be released sometime in April, and then of course it needs a vote in Planning Commission. If it gets through that, it will go to a council vote, and they are hoping to get this all accomplished by the end of June when council goes on summer recess.
Thank you very much, Becca Costello. You can learn more about the proposed Connected Communities Plan at wvxu.org. I'm Bill Reinhardt. This is 91.7 WVXU.
Support for the State House News Bureau stories on 91.7 WVXU and 88.5 WMUB comes from the Ohio Education Association, representing 131,000 teachers, support professionals, and higher education faculty who are working for great public schools for every child. Online at ohea.org. Support comes from the Anderson Clinic. If you or someone you love suffers from treatment-resistant depression, anxiety, or PTSD, the Anderson Clinic offers ketamine infusions and PRTMS, a personalized EEG-guided approach to transcranial magnetic stimulation. Visit andersonclinic.net to learn more.
This traffic report is supported by Direct Auto Insurance, formerly Safe Auto Insurance. Northbound 75 after Cincinnati Dayton Road, there's a wreck. There's one on Westwood Northern Boulevard at Beekman and Hopple, and a big old pothole at Martin Luther King Jr. Drive and Jefferson and Vine Streets. Mostly cloudy, 30 tonight. Wintry mix midday tomorrow with a high near 40. It's 36 degrees now.
From NPR News, this is All Things Considered. I'm Sarah McCammon.
And I'm Ari Shapiro. The fight over banned books